So I'm sitting here with Lynette Hull, who has been a student of iconography for the past 11 years with the Proserpine School of Iconography and Iconology, or Iconology and Iconography.
Iconology and Iconography.
Okay. So is it fair to call you a practicing iconographer? Or?
Sure.
Yeah, okay.
Yep. I do make icons.
Okay, so we're eager to hear what that means. So let me start off by asking you what is an icon?
Good question. An icon is a representation of Christ, and Christ is the first icon of God. So as the Orthodox Church understands the icon is a symbol and a testimony to the fact that God became incarnate in Christ. So it's a combination of the divine and the material in the image of Christ. And every icon talks about that.
And is focused that way.
It's focused that way. Even a saint that you would see, because the saint has been united with Christ, it is therefore really Christ that you're seeing. So with that definition of icon, what is iconography exactly? Well, iconography is the practice of making the icons, and it's a liturgical practice that has been handed down for millennia. It started essentially in the 6th century, and then there was iconoclasm, and then it really began to flourish in the Byzantine Empire in the 9th, 10th century.
And has been a continuous feature?
It's been continuous ever since then, and there's obviously different cultural nuances and differences, Russian, Greek, Bulgarian icons, and I have learned iconography with an American iconographer. So it's a new iteration, in a sense, of the very old tradition.
And you would call it a living tradition?
Absolutely. It's every culture has their own expression of this liturgical faith.
That people still use and practice with.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's
not something that belongs in the museum.
No, it's not in the museum. I just had 2 icons in the church where I attend. So they are used every Sunday.
Okay. Why would you say that iconography is important in this day and age?
We live in an incredibly visual age. And if you look around us, we as a culture, and every culture has icons. You see them, in fact, in the back of some newspapers on the front section, there's a whole title section, icons, and it has the icons of the week. And so, they might select movie stars or watches or whatever it is that they're calling an icon. But in this day and age, the religious icon is very important because it stands in a sense, contradistinction to all the visual fluff that we have. And this is something that's solid and real. It's been passed down for generations, and it is the infusion of the divine with the material. So not only is it sort of in contradistinction to the visual fluff and reproduction that we have, but it's also a testimony to the fact that the world is more than just the material world that we see.
So it's still, it's considered an instance whereby we can have some kind of communion, or would you call it that, a communion with the divine somehow? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when a person enters into a church, usually an Orthodox church that has icons there is a presence, and people often don't necessarily articulate it, but you understand that you are in a presence of God.
And so, okay, we'll move on. I think some of this will get fleshed out. How did you become an iconographer? Let's start. Can you be an iconographer and not be
Orthodox?
That's
a good question. So the Orthodox Church in the Seventh Ecumenical Council gave or selected or articulated 3 symbols of the church, and it was the word, the cross, and the icon. And so all 3 of those things act as a way of union for the divine to the material. The word being the scriptures, and that's God's word to man. And the icon, in a sense, is man, and understanding man and ascending to God. And it meets at the cross. And so those are the vehicles through which God talks to us.
So it's a mode of revelation.
So it's a mode of revelation, and it still is. It's not something that happened and then was finished, but the icon is still continuing to reveal God to man. So just as you would give somebody a Bible to read if they were interested in Christianity, they can look or do or practice iconography as a way to learn about God. It would be inappropriate, of course, to have an icon in an Orthodox setting that was made by somebody who was not Orthodox or was not blessed in the church. Mm-hmm. And there's certainly plenty of icons that shouldn't be in the church. Not every icon should be used liturgically in a public manner. Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
And how did you become an iconographer?
Well, speaking of which, I started out as Presbyterian, and I grew up Presbyterian. So my first icon class I took as non-Orthodox. And then what happened to me was, as I was raising my children, I was very concerned about the weight and the lure of this culture that we live in, and how it just didn't seem like it was going to, my children would be able to sort of withstand the onslaught, the tidal wave of the culture. So there was a statistic circulating when I was parenting that only 17% of cradle Orthodox cradle Protestant actually stay Protestant. And to me that was really disturbing, because I was working really hard so that my kids would have a living and true faith. And obviously as a parent you can't enforce that and you can't make it happen. But as I was looking around and seeing that, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense, I started to read outside the tradition. I read some books by Alexander Schmemann and Paul Evdokimov about Orthodoxy, and it seemed very interesting, but of course it was very foreign. Having grown up Presbyterian, Orthodox is about as polar opposite from the Presbyterian faith as you can get. So one day I happened to see in our local throwaway newspaper a classified ad, a real tiny classified ad saying that there was a iconography workshop. And I thought, wow, that's kind of interesting. Maybe I'll do it. And my kids all were in camp, and I thought, gosh, I'm going to go for it. And I'd never studied art. I have no art background. And I took the class and fell in love. Mm-hmm. So I just kept doing it.
And what was the school that you, was that the
That was the Prosopon school. So it was in Princeton. I live in Princeton, New Jersey. And the Prosopon school is a school without walls. So it has classes all over North America, about 34 to 35 classes a year, week-long classes, and a teacher will come and give a very basic icon class, beginners, and they also have intermediate and advanced. But for the beginners, they do all these workshops all over the country. So that was the workshop I took, and the first icon that you make is Archangel Michael, because Michael is of the heavenly hierarchy. He's the closest to man, and he battles against sin, and he was the angel that stood out. He stood outside the Garden of Eden. So you do Archangel Michael first, and then the second icon that you do in the school is Archangel Gabriel. So you have basically the whole economy of salvation, sin and redemption. Mm-hmm. Michael, and then Gabriel, who announces the good news. Right. So those are the first two icons you do in the school.
Yeah. Wow. What would you say is particularly distinctive about the Prosopon school? Is it does every school have a distinctive character, or are they all pretty much the same? Are you receiving a training that any iconographers like
Yeah, well, it's interesting because actually, traditionally in countries like Russia and Greece, there are no 6-day workshops. That's something that's particularly American. And in Russia or Greece, you would go study at an iconography school, but you're basically studying with a master, and you're apprenticing, and you're taking classes there, and it's a long process. Here, because of everybody works in it, and people mostly are not Orthodox who take it, the classes, they are held in churches, and there's 6 days, so you sort of get, especially in your first 2 or 3 icons, you sort of get dragged through the process. So you have a global idea of what an icon is and how to make it. And it's very intense. It's 48 hours, and you do not stop working from the time you start until the time you're done. And the distinctive method about the Prosopone School is that they're actually, the reason why it's the School of Iconology and Iconography is because they're not really interested in making icons. The icon, in a sense, is a byproduct of what they're working on, which is you're working on the student's inner icon. So if we are a reflection of Christ, Christ is the first icon of God. He was the living image of God on earth. And so we, who are made in the image and likeness of God, well, we're made in the image of God, and we are to become like God. So because we have that image in us, that is like a little tiny seed that has been undiscovered. And the process of, in Protestant world, you'd say sanctification, is of uncovering that seed and allowing it to grow and become that likeness of God, to become more fully functional and more fully embodied. So the practice of the school is every step of the process, and there are 22 steps. Every step of that process is connected to the theology and also to the nature of man. So you have a distinctive thing about icons in general and about Orthodoxy is their understanding of man. Man is not just body and soul. Instead, the human being is body, soul, and spirit. So you have a cosmic, a material self, you have a noetic, which is a spiritual and or angelic self, and then you have the final body, soul, and spirit is sort of the divine, that divine that's within you. So in the process of making the icon, you are learning each step of the way all 3 of those things. Cosmic, anthropos, and theocosmic world is infused, and as you learn that, it begins to uncover that little bit, the logos that's within you. So that's very distinctive, because a lot of people, Greeks and Russians, you sit down and people will say, oh, to be an iconographer, I need to fast, and I need to pray, and I need to listen to the right kind of music, and I need to wear a head covering. And yes, the icon, the light is all from within. So that's what we're going to learn how to do, is make the light from within. So they say prayers, and you have your head covering on, but then you turn and you make your icon. And there's very specific sort of artistic steps that you can take to make that icon, and when you're done, you've made an icon. And that's a wonderful thing, and you learn a lot from that. But the Prosopone School isn't so much about making that icon as it is each step of the way connecting it to the theology and then connecting it to your inner self. And actually, I recently spoke with a monk, and he said that idea of connecting everything to theology is very Russian. So maybe it all comes from Russia anyway. Okay.
So we were talking about the pedagogy of the Prosopone School, and I was interested, we had talked before about the issue of style and how one's personal style can appear. Well, it leads me to my...
But before you do that, can we go back a little bit? Because I'd like to give an illustration of one thing that I think is really distinctive about the pedagogy. Okay. So for me, coming into the school as a Presbyterian, which is a very aniconic, there are no images anywhere. The very first class I was taking, the first layer of paint that you put down, it's called the Rosh Krish. And the Rosh Krish is a very granular and sort of intense color. And you need to do that because if you are building up light, you've got to have a base upon which to work. So you add 3 different types of pigments together and you make this very gritty sort of solution. and you're putting it down. And one thing that the teacher said, he said, this is like in Genesis when it says the Spirit of God moved across the face of the deep. And because you're doing it in this very liquid manner, and you're moving the pigment around, and you're swirling it, but the brush never touches the board. So you're on top of the water, and it's allowing the pigments to just settle as they will, so that you don't see the hand or the stroke of the iconographer. So as we're doing this as a Presbyterian, I'm thinking, this material is really important. And in Genesis, God said that this was good. And I kept thinking, wow, I mean, I couldn't even build the icon unless I had this layer. And that material, it's like all of the world is material we have to be embodied in order to do anything. And it just clicked for me how radically different that was in a Presbyterian Calvinistic background, where, you know, you had the world that God made. It was good, but then it fell, and now it's completely, utterly bankrupt. There's nothing good in it at all. And for me, coming to this idea that the material was actually still really important and actually had the imprint of God on it was a transformative thing. To me, that was a huge shift, and it happened while you were painting. It didn't happen because of lectures or anything else, but the action of doing it after hearing the setup for it, and you begin to internalize what's going on, that methodology is through all those 22 steps. And by the end of it, you've come through this very theologically grounded and embodied practice of faith.
Well, you made a comparison there then between, or your teacher was making a comparison between what you were doing as a icon maker and what God did sort of at creation. So can you sort of elaborate on that? What is that comparison? How is it that human beings can be compared to God in that way?
Well, I mean, we are made in the image of God, and God is creative. And so as you are working on the icon and practicing that sort of creativity, not in the sense of doing something ex nihilo or in the sense of this is my own ego doing something, but in the sense of participating in the creation. I mean, literally, the practice of each step, you are creating an icon, and that sort of creativity reflects God. The whole practice of these 22 steps and the making the icon is a sort of an anagogical and ascending form, literally, in making the icon. At the very end, you're doing the final strokes. They're very tiny. You know, you're no longer working on the whole board. So that's a ladder of ascent, and theologically, each layer that you're putting on is a type of ladder of ascent, and you have that sense of liturgical practice of
bringing something into being that
was not there before,
right?
And also tying it back to your own heart and seeing what was uncovered, what was you didn't necessarily know before, and now you do know something.
So what would be, so the process of uncovering, what would you say is, could you just elaborate on that a little bit? What would you be uncovering in that process? About, it sounds like about yourself or about your own? Well,
I mean, for me, everybody obviously has a different characteristic and personality and whatnot, so each person's discovery is going to be different and unique for themselves. But for me, I remember one time I was watching my teacher, Vladislav Andreev, work on the icon of the Pentecost, which is a very elaborate icon, and there's all 12 apostles are sitting around. So he would work on the highlights of one apostle, and then he'd move to another one, and then he'd move to a third, and then he'd go back, and he'd come back and put a few more strokes on the first apostle. And I was watching him, I thought, this is what love is about. This is how you really love somebody. You might give them something, or you might show them something, and then you just need to let it be. You don't insist, you don't demand, you just let it go, and then you go over here and give that other person, that other apostle, time to soak in, literally soak in with the paint. And then you come back and you might put a few more strokes, you might enter into the relationship a little, and then you let it go. And I realize there's this lovely sense of freedom and this lovely sense of recognition of the other person as a person. And so love is this offering. And I thought, wow, I mean, how impressive is that? You can do that at home. I mean, here I have 3 kids and I'm constantly trying to get to do something, and maybe I could just relax a little bit and show them and then let it go. Now, probably many more people are more evolved people than I am and did a much better parenting job. But for me, that was an enormous revelation to really sort of see the action of love in this very practical way.
In the work on the icon itself.
Yeah, in the work on the icon. And so in that way, the icon is a reflecting mirror that allows you as the person, the student, the iconographer, to practice sobriety and discernment, which is something that's essential for the spiritual life. You have to learn how to discern. And this is a forum in which you can do that.
In the very activity itself.
In the activity itself.
Interesting. So let me ask a slightly different question. So as an iconographer, do you consider yourself an artist?
No, not really. There are plenty of people who are trained as artists who become iconographers, and they do a wonderful job. I had no artistic training at all. Probably the last time I had painted was in 2nd grade. So when I started to do this, I came to it purely as somebody who was interested in the icon and was totally ignorant about it. So for me, it's been a real journey of spiritual enlightenment and growth. And about 5 years after starting, I converted to Orthodoxy, and I've continued to practice iconography. And it's been wonderful because the attending services and the liturgy of the Orthodox Church is so steeped in the patristic mind, and the poetry of the hymnography combined with the cycle of feast and the iconography is an incredibly rich and nuanced expression of faith.
And so in that context too, you're seeing, image and liturgy contributing to your worship experience.
Totally,
so that's a very
fulsome.
Yeah, very fulsome. And obviously a way that's evokes the spiritual side of you through your sensate.
Yes, totally.
Yeah, which is different from maybe the way you were raised. What do you feel that the relationship between art and religion is? Just to add to that.
Just to go on with that.
Which is a fairly big question, so I apologize.
In 2 minutes or less.
Yeah, right.
As an Orthodox person, art, you could say that if you have the cross, and there's an Orthodox cross where it says Phos and Zoe, Phos being light, P-H-O-S, and Zoe being life. And in the school where I study, the icon is a combination of the light, and life is color. And so all of our life that we experience and that we practice really needs to be sort of the art of embodying that light. So in a sense, all of religion is an artistic practice, and the liturgy is an art. Because we need, as embodied people, as embodied creatures, to be able to relate to God in our material way. Yeah. Well, I can quote Aquinas, who's not very orthodox, but he has this great quote that says, the soul is not a soul without a body. And I think that, we are not, there is no soul unless you have a body. And that's something I think we tend to forget.
In our human condition.
In our human condition, yeah. So we need our bodies.
And
yeah.
Right. Okay. Do you want to elaborate on that? Are we? It's very okay.
There's a lot to talk about there.
There's a lot to talk about. Okay, well, I think we're going to bring it to a close pretty soon. So we often think of icons as reducing the role of the artist. So is there a role for human creativity in icon making?
Right. Well, that's an interesting question for you to ask, given that I don't have an artistic background. So I've never felt that struggle of having been trained in sort of a Western way of approaching art, which is I, as a human person, need to express myself or say something. Mm-hmm. I have, since I was not trained that way, when I came to the icon, it was not a conflict for me. Mm-hmm. Because for me, it was this wonderful process, and I felt very creative. I've seen many people who are artists who have a hard time with that. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason why it's difficult is because practicing a liturgical art that has canonical forms seems restrictive, because it's not myself explaining what I need to explain. But what it is it really is a form of obedience, that when you obey the canon and come to understand this, then there's a richer sort of freedom that occurs, and within the context of that, creativity develops. Now, you're not necessarily creating new forms, but one absolutely has all sorts of creative choices, and each icon is an expression of the person who made it. Mm. So having studied for 11 years and knowing a lot of people who've become practicing iconographers, it's really interesting to be able to say, oh, I can see that's Nikita's hand, and that's Dimitri's hand, and that's Susan's hand, and I can absolutely tell that this is their icon, because there's always, as humans who are made in the image of God and naturally creative, you always express yourself, even though you don't mean to. Mm. So it's an interesting sort of balance that happens. I think that for some, there are plenty of people who are artists who start this who drop because they just do not like having to conform to something. But if you allow yourself to get to a certain point, there's an infinite creative world within the context of the icon.
Mm. So it sounds like when you talk about, when you put together your explanation of sort of the spiritual practice of making icons, that what gets expressed in terms of style, which I noticed in reading the literature around the Prosopon school, style is a word that he equates with the icon itself, eidos.
Yes.
So it sounds like in recognizing that style, you're also recognizing the spiritual practice of a person, of the place where they...
Well, that's something that's incredibly orthodox, because one of the key tenets of orthodoxy, and is really very distinctive from many Protestant traditions, Western traditions, is the idea of human freedom. And the fact that God never wants to... you are made in the image of God, and God is infinite and contains the entire universe within him, and there's infinite form and creativity there within this context of God. And in Orthodoxy, the person, as you unite to God, you unite, but you don't then flatten that personality. In fact, that personality becomes more manifest and becomes more realized. And so you can imagine, like in the heavenly kingdom, you have all these incredible personalities. There's going to be such sparkle because of each person is fully realized. And that's what happens in the icon, is the person has this ascetic practice of cutting off their will, but yet as you cut off your will, the more you do that, you actually find the true self of who you are is more fully realized and becomes more manifest and more beautiful. So it's this incredible sort of it's so not the normal for the Western mind. Do you know what I mean? And for a Western practice, when you think of, you know, the desert and monks as being, you know, you've got to cut it off, you've got to wear the hair shirt, you've got to beat yourself up, and there's a suppression of the self. But actually, for the Orthodox, there's this beautiful final flowering of the self, which continues through all eternity. And that's one of the things about the icon that I find so endlessly exciting is you are the self of who I am is more and more fully realized all the time, and the
closer it gets to God,
the closer you get to God. And it's like, you know, the art of prayer. As you pray, there are forms of how to pray, but how that, it's like, you know, in music, that there's in the silences can be bigger or smaller. They can be more sort of verdant and fulsome with, you know, you can be at the beginning of the silence or the end of the silence. It's kind of like that with prayer and with God. It's like, it can be pretty flat if you want it to be, but that's not what the fulsomeness of what is there. And so as the more you restrict certain things, the more the things that weigh you down and that actually entrap you, if you restrict that, the true self gets to finally express itself in a way that is really lovely.
That's great. Okay. So my final question, I think, how does what you do as an icon maker, which you've been describing in terms of a spiritual practice, relate then to its liturgical function, the liturgical function of the icon in the context of worship, and then also to the viewer who then will relate to it in worship?
Right. Well, today in our culture, we have all these paper icons that are around and everybody buys them and uses them and whatever. And there's a role for that. But that is not a substitute for a handmade icon on a wooden board with real materials. As an iconographer, if I make an icon for somebody, typically what happens is there's this period of meditation about that icon where you decide what it's going to be on, decide how you do it, the dimensions, you make the board or order the board, and you set the thing up, and that requires a certain amount of thought and care and prayer. And then you go through the process of it and the practice of it, which is along the way you're constantly thinking and meditating and praying. You've read about the saint's life, you've talked to the person, so there's this whole dynamic relationship that develops with the person who is receiving the icon and you and actually the icon itself. So you have that relationship with the icon. So I myself might make an icon and I might learn personally things from it, both practically and spiritually. But I'm also, when somebody commissions an icon, you're also praying for that person and however that icon is going to be used. And then you let it go, obviously. You give it to the person, and then they will have their own relationship with that icon. If it's going to a church, it has a different relationship. And the priest will often bless the icon before it's behind the altar in the church so that it can have a liturgical function. And it's interesting. So for icons that I've made that are in the chapel where I attend, it's like somebody who is a restaurateur, and every time they go to a restaurant, they have this like, oh, well, they didn't put the forks right, or the food's not right, or the service is... So you definitely have that. Like I have that every Sunday when I look at the icons. I'm like, oh, is that bright enough? I should have changed this. I should have done that. So there's that, but that's completely independent from what's going on for the people who are in church and worshiping. And the icon is always and will always be a symbol, which is means union, and it's uniting the heavenly to the material. So it's a literal testimony and incarnation in action of Christ in the material, and that is a powerful life of its own that's independent of the person who makes it, and it's independent of the person who, in a sense, even buys the icon, because I mean, I would hope that the icon would last well beyond my lifetime. One of the things that traditionally iconographers don't do is they don't sign their icon, at least on the front. Some people do things on the back. And the reason for that is it's not about the iconographer, it's not about the ego, it's not about anything, their stroke mark or anything. But as you're making it, you realize that it becomes part of the church. And that church is this living, dynamic presence of Christ on earth.
Okay. So what would be the spiritual practice of someone who was experiencing an icon in church? What would be how would it be a meditative experience? What would they...
Well, I mean, the liturgical function of an icon, you can have different things. I mean, it could be sort of educational, where it could be sort of a historical feast where they're learning about the feast. It can be a dogmatic expression of faith for the church, and it can be a personal interaction. So there are plenty of people. I mean, usually in the Orthodox Church, you venerate the icon, you can kiss the icon. So some people become more attached to an icon, and by that they're not really attached to the board, they're attached to the saint that's portrayed on the board, and through that they're attached to Christ. So in a sense, that icon disappears. In a way, the work that I have done should disappear, and it becomes more, I mean, some people call them windows to heaven, which is certainly one way to conceptualize it. What
do you think?
I think we're doing very well.
Okay.
And if we wanted to do a wrap, I'd like to thank her and wish her
a
good presentation.
Yeah.
Then you could probably look right about here. What my hand is.
Where your hand is, okay. Well, I'll turn to Lynette, and thank you very much for sharing your, what do we call our, it was the practice and reflections of a working iconographer. And I thank you very much for sharing with us. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah. Is that okay? Well, I wasn't looking where you said.
Yeah, it was right up until that.